The essence of the message was there is hope, that your past does not need to determine your future, that your life can be changed, it can be transformed, and you can know life as you were meant to know it.
This is Convicted, a podcast sharing stories of hope from inside. Join David Binder every fortnight as he interviews ex-offenders, chaplains and volunteers about the amazing things God is doing in UK prisons right now.
Hi, welcome to Convicted with me, David Binder. Dorothy, great to have you with us today. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from.
It's great to be with you. My name's Dorothy Russell. I'm from Glasgow in Scotland. I was born and brought up in Rutherglen, just on the south side of Glasgow.
Did you go straight into prison ministry, prison work, or had you been doing other kind of jobs before that?
Yeah, I suppose I need to go back a wee bit until I became a Christian. When I was 14, I was involved in the local church in the estate where I grew up. I had been going along there and came to faith in my teenage years. And at the time, the minister of the church there was a Church of Scotland. He was a chaplain in a prison in Glasgow, a low-category prison in Glasgow. And he used to take our youth group into the prison, maybe a couple of times a year, Christmas, Easter, different times. That kind of whetted my appetite a bit for, people in that situation, that kind of people group. Then when I was 18, I remember being at friends' home, people in the church, friends in the church, who had invited a crowd of folk round to their home one evening. We had a meal together, and then we heard someone speak. And this man gave his testimony, and I had never heard quite the like of it before, because I suppose in some ways I had a fairly sheltered upbringing. But I heard this man speak about his involvement with gangs, running with gangs in Glasgow and different things. And he had eventually served a sentence for attempted murder. And he was in Barlinnie prison in Glasgow, where he came to faith through the work of chaplains or Bible study group in Barlinnie. And I remember sitting on the floor in my friend's house at the age of 18 thinking, if God can change this man, then he can change anyone. And that lit something within me that never really went out. And so over the years, from then up until I retired a couple of years ago, I've always had some kind of involvement in prison ministry. I suppose the biggest involvement was back in the mid-90s, where there was a week of mission running across all the prisons in Scotland. And I was invited by one of the chaplains of the same prison, in fact, that we had gone into way back when I was 15. I would put together a music group to go in and help them with their week of mission. That ended up in me putting a team together. And in actual fact, we ran the week of mission in the prison. And it was a great experience. I would love to say that hundreds of people came to faith, but that would just not be true. But it was a great experience. It was a good experience for the church that I was involved in to be involved in that way. And so from there, I was invited, or our team were invited to go into that prison in Glasgow. It's Low Moss prison in Glasgow, and to be a volunteer group working alongside the chaplains. And we did that for 13 years up until they closed Low Moss prison. And it was actually razed to the ground, and they rebuilt a new state-of-the-art prison in its place. So that was my kind of early involvement and experience at prison ministry.
We'll pick up that story in a little bit, but I'd just love to hear more actually about your own personal faith, Dorothy, if that's okay. So tell us about how you became...
Okay, so back, as I said, when I was 14 years, just coming up to my 15th birthday, we'd had a change of ministry in the church that I was going along to. Well, it was really a kind of coming together. There was another younger couple came to the church as well, very committed young couple, and the assistant minister that we had as well and his wife. So there were 6 people there who were very, very interested in young people and so on in the church. And they took a group of us, I remember on the 4th of January 1969, to an event in East Kilbride, which was not that far from where we lived. And now, to put this into the context of my personal life, I was a painfully shy child when I was young. And at the end of the meeting, there was an appeal put out, kind of Billy Graham type thing, that if anybody wanted to give their life to Jesus, that they should step forward. And if you had asked me before I went to that, if I would respond to something like that and get out of my seat and step, I would have said absolutely not, because everything within me would be saying no. I just didn't have the confidence to do that. But in fact, when that appeal went out, in spite of the fact I was sitting in the middle of the row of all my friends and these leaders that had taken us along, I found myself at the front and gave my life to the Lord. Again, about 1973, I remember, Spree 73 it was called, down in London, Earl's Court. Billy Graham was having a huge kind of crusade, and 4 people from our church, myself included, were sent really as delegates down to this thing in London. And for me, that was exciting in itself, because I'd never been in London before. And so it was the first time visiting there. But I went there, and I think at that point, again, just at one of the meetings there was the opportunity for those who had come to faith to really surrender their lives to Christ. And I took that opportunity to do that. So I think those 2 things, were fairly major in a sense for me at that stage of my life.
And so going back then to your prison involvement and your kind of volunteering, you were saying, I understand you became a paid prison chaplain. Tell us kind of what made you take that jump or that leap from volunteering and kind of doing the stuff you mentioned earlier to, wanting, kind of deciding, actually, I want to do this in a more paid or permanent capacity.
Actually, the honest answer to that is that I didn't.
Okay.
That may seem very strange, but I had no real thought that I could be a chaplain. It wasn't something on my radar at all. Historically in Scotland, you had to be an ordained minister in order to become a chaplain. And I wasn't an ordained minister, so there was no opportunity. And in working life, I left school when I was 16. Went into a job and really moved to various jobs, but I was involved in finance and accountancy, that kind of thing. And so I did that for 35 years. And at that stage, I was 50 years old. And I remember just sitting up in bed and thinking, Lord, here I am. What do you want me to do now? And I was encouraged by a friend to return to some counselling studies that I had been doing in the year 2000. And I resisted it initially, but eventually I did go back and do the course, and I completed a counselling diploma. And I wasn't quite sure why. I got an email from the then Church of Scotland advisor to the Scottish Prison Service saying to me that they were about to advertise a part-time vacancy at Shotts Prison, and he thought I might be interested. And I remember thinking to myself, well, why do you think I might be interested? And how did you get my email address? Yes. I don't even know you. And but the fact of the matter was, I was quite interested. When I received the email, I applied for the job and was granted an interview. And I thought it was the worst interview that I had ever been involved in. And later that evening, I got a phone call to say that they were offering me the part-time position. And I just thought, Lord, is this you? Is this real? Is this what I have to do? And so I accepted. And then after 6 months, the full-time colleague that I was working with left. I had to go back into church ministry in the local community. And over a period of time, I was eventually offered the full-time post, which I then did for 12 and a half years.
Amazing. Yeah, what a story. I mean, as with all ministry, there are highs, there are lows, there are in-between moments. Let's start with the highs and tell us about a particular encouragement kind of that you've had as a chaplain?
The one thing that comes to mind, and it was quite early on in my time, I was chaplain in Shotts Prison. Shotts Prison was a maximum security prison, all adult males, with a population about 550 men in it. And to be in Shotts Prison, you had to have been sentenced to a minimum of 4 years or more, but probably the average sentence in Shotts at that time was about 16 years. For some people, they were serving up to 35 years or so. So it was long term, which brought many advantages in terms of chaplaincy. But I remember very early on running our first Christianity Explored course. And we were all sitting around a table looking at Mark's Gospel. And we had asked one of the prisoners if he would read a section of Mark's Gospel, which he did. And so then we asked a few questions, had a bit of discussion, but my colleague and I were very conscious that this man who we'd asked to read wasn't engaging in the discussion. And he was flicking his way through the Mark's Gospel, reading it and turning the pages. And eventually, in the middle of all our discussion, he lifted his head and said, "See this Jesus that I am reading about here? Did he really do all of these things, like calming the sea and raising the dead and healing the sick and so on?" And we said, "Yes." And he said, "Why has no one ever told me about him before?" And we were just amazed, absolutely amazed at this man. And it made me realise, in many ways, how ignorant people are of what the Bible actually teaches and of who Jesus is. Whereas when I reflected back to when I got involved, as a teenager and going into Lomos Prison, people knew at that stage, they knew who Jesus was. They understood a bit about the Bible because it was still taught in our schools. And many of young people still went to Sunday school or went to boys' brigade groups or something. So they heard the Bible and they knew the Bible. But here we were, at least a generation or more later, and they had no clue at all. And it made me realise that, the opportunities here to introduce people to this person that actually they've never heard about before and never met were just massive.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing. We'll just stick on that theme for a little bit longer. Through services, Sunday chapel services, through kind of Bible study stuff like you were just mentioning, with Christianity Explored, and other stuff too, I'm sure. Can you just share a little bit about kind of what in essence was the message you were trying to share with prisoners?
I think, in essence, the message was that God loves you. Jesus died so that your sins can be forgiven, whatever they are, and that forgiveness is freely available, albeit at a huge cost. Grace is not cheap, but at a huge cost to Christ, but freely available to us. And I think the essence of the message was there is hope, that your past does not need to determine your future, that your life can be changed, it can be transformed, and you can know life as you were meant to know it. And I think too, I was always keen to point out to people that they are made in the image of God, and for that reason alone they are of value and of worth, and they are loved.
Amen to that, absolutely. And so, as I said earlier, every ministry has its challenges. Tell us about what that might have looked like for you, Dorothy, in Shotts.
I think the main challenges that we had were that chaplaincy in general was pretty low down the pecking order in terms of what was seen as important. Prisons, I should probably appreciate, can be very hard places for people to live. And I think we as chaplains saw ourselves as the kind of softer side of the Scottish Prison Service. But we did face many challenges because there are many things that we may have wanted to do, but getting disciplined staff like a prison officer to be present with us because we weren't allowed to run groups or anything like that without a prison officer available, and actually trying to get that support sometimes from the prison was a challenge. And so it was difficult to guarantee that if we were putting on a class or a course or anything, to know for certain that we would be able to run it for the length of time that it had to run. Church services were different because by law, certainly in Scotland, we are required to have a service of worship. And so by law, they had to facilitate that. And so it was only if either they had staff available or, to be honest, it depended on who your line manager was and how sympathetic they were to the work of chaplains, and if they understood what chaplains were actually about, that we might get a bit more support than at other times. So we just had to kind of roll with it in a sense and be flexible.
Sticking with kind of life at HMP Shotts, tell us, if you can, there might not be such a thing, but what might, I suppose, a typical day have looked like for you, for you, Dorothy, just to paint a picture for our listeners?
Yeah, you're right. Typical day didn't really exist in a sense. Really, for me, Sunday was the only kind of day that was much the same from week to week. But going in on a Monday morning, it just depended what the emails were, what the referrals were, and so on. Shotts Prison, because Shotts Prison is a long-term establishment, we didn't receive prisoners, for example, who were awaiting trial, who were being held on remand. They would be held at some other prison, either in Glasgow or Edinburgh or further up the country. And it wasn't until after a trial and after a conviction and sentencing that they would eventually end up in prison. So we didn't have the same kind of first night stay that other prisons may have. So in other prisons, chaplains would be visiting people who had been brought in for the first time. We didn't have that so much because anyone who arrived at Shotts Prison had been in the system somewhere else. They were familiar with prison and so on. So we didn't have that necessarily. But certainly, yes, we did go down to the halls to see, maybe prisoners who had just arrived in from somewhere else. Often we would get referrals from chaplains from other prisons to say that so-and-so has been transferred to you now, blah, blah, and we would go look them up. So, yeah, a typical day, if we were running courses or doing things, obviously they would happen on set days and so on. I would go down to the halls. I would have appointments to see various prisoners for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they'd be referred to us. Sometimes they would just speak to me in the hall and ask if they could get an appointment to see me. And I would go down and just chat with them, talk to them, help them in whatever we could. The other thing that we were responsible for was that we were the kind of liaison person between the prison and families in the instance of a death in custody. And when that occurred, that superseded anything else really that was in the diary. And that, for me, certainly, that took priority. And so we were very, very involved in that, going out to visit the family. We didn't notify them, obviously, of the death. That's the responsibility of the police. But we, as chaplains, were the people who got in touch with the family, would go out and speak to them and try and offer them some pastoral support, as well as offering pastoral support to perhaps staff on the wing or other prisoners in the hall where a death had occurred. And often that involved us in taking funerals and so on, people who had either died or who had taken their own lives. So that was a kind of difficult part of the job, but a privilege in some ways to, as with anyone, I think, in ministry, to sit and be with people in that dark place of a death.
No, thanks. I just want to take us back, that really good story you were sharing about the Christianity Explored course, and that guy who was flicking through Mark's Gospel saying, wow, why has no one ever told me about this Jesus guy before? Tell us, Dorothy, did you find, whether it was doing like Bible studies or services, did you find the guys you were working with, were they receptive, or were they not receptive, or was it kind of a mixture of both? What did you tend to find?
I think it was a mixture. There were those who came up to the chapel really seeking something because they tried everything else. Perhaps when they were outside, maybe getting involved in drugs or, whatever. When life wasn't going well for them, they had tried all sorts of things to find where they belonged, to find happiness, to find purpose in life. So we had some very genuine seekers who came up to the church. We had others who came because we gave out tea and coffee, a biscuit at the end of the service. And that's fine. That was the reality of the situation. And quite often I would have officers in the hall who would say to me, you do know that he's only coming up for the tea or the coffee? And I was like, I don't care. He's there. He's hearing the message. He's hearing the Bible preached. He's being welcomed, etc., etc. So it didn't trouble me in that sense that people were maybe there for what other people would see as the wrong reason. Because I think God can work in every situation. And even although they didn't think they were going to get caught up in anything other than just drinking tea or coffee, invariably, because they were accepted, because I had a team of volunteers who came in to the prison on a Sunday to the services, and they were welcomed and befriended by these people and made to feel important and never questioned about what crime they had committed, because essentially it really didn't matter in a sense to us. We're not there to judge them at all. They've already been judged by the court system. It's not our job to judge. And so we just welcomed them with open arms and perhaps offered them something that they hadn't experienced in their life before. And so they would tend to come back. Others would come along for a season and then you wouldn't ever see them again. And that's just how it was. We just kind of accepted who came, shared the Bible with them.
You mentioned now you're retired. I guess now you're retired, do you sort of miss being a prison chaplain, or are you kind of glad to be out of it, as it were?
I certainly initially, when I retired, because I retired from full-time work straight to doing nothing, that was difficult because I felt I was sitting around the house thinking, I should be doing something, But in some ways, because I retired at the end of 2021, and we were really just coming out of COVID lockdown at that time, I had my mother, who was in a care home, who had lived all through the COVID lockdown in a care home, and the horror that was for her and many people, and for families having to deal with a situation like that. So when I retired, I decided to devote my time to taking Mum out as often as she was able to go and so on. And so I suppose in some ways I missed it a bit, but not a lot, because my whole focus was on Mum. Now, Mum passed away in June last year, and it's almost like I've retired a second time, in a sense, because I didn't have that commitment. And all of a sudden, I was thinking, right, okay, who am I now? I'm no longer a carer for Mum. I'm no longer a prison chaplain. So I suppose I missed it, in a sense, all over again in June last year. But I'm still involved a bit with a group called Junction 42, which is a prison through care group. And they have a meeting in Edinburgh, a Connect meeting on a Wednesday evening. And that's set up to support ex-offenders or people in drug recovery and so on. So I've still got, my hand in a little bit there. And interestingly enough, just a couple of days ago, I was invited by a friend who's running a choir in one of the prisons in Scotland, not in Shotts. And I thought, would I or wouldn't I do it? So I'm still mulling that over. I still definitely have a heart for people in prison and to see their lives being changed and transformed by the gospel. But I don't know now that I'm desperately keen to be back in the front line of chaplaincy.
Sure. No, really, really fascinating stuff. Somebody listening to this, thinking, everything you're saying, Dorothy, sounds really good, really fascinating. You know, I'd love to get involved in prison ministry, but it sounds terrifying. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think, people on the outside who've never been in a prison before probably think about it as a really scary place and not somewhere that they would want to be. I understand that. And often I have been asked the question, did I ever feel afraid when I was in the prison? And my answer to that was no. I used to be a street pastor for a number of years, and I was more concerned about my safety when I was walking through the streets of Glasgow between 10 o'clock at night and 4 o'clock in the morning than I ever was for my safety in the prison in Shotts. And as I say, Shotts is a long-term prison. People did not get into Shotts prison for shoplifting out of Marks and Spencer's. A lot of them were serious criminals. But I think I can honestly say that as a street pastor, you never know who's walking up and down past you in the street and whether they're armed with a knife or some other weapon or whatever. But I think I can say with pretty much certainty that you're not likely to be attacked by anyone in the prison carrying a weapon or anything. So I'm going to say it couldn't happen, but never in my experience. And actually, certainly within chaplaincy and even chaplaincy volunteers coming in, I think there was a genuine respect from prisoners and a real gratefulness and thankfulness that people were willing to give up their time to come in and be with them and to accept them and not to judge them. And certainly in the prison, I know that the prisoners had my back. In fact, I mean, to share a story with you of an occasion where a prisoner had got upset with me about something, and it was simply that I had told him something that he didn't want to hear. And he went back down to the hall and he had threatened, in the hearing of officers, had threatened to do me a bit of harm. And basically I was told that I was not allowed to go near him or to see him or anything so. And I knew, because of who the chap was, I knew that he was just sounding off. I really did not think for 1 minute that he would ever think to carry it through. But the interesting thing is that a couple of days afterwards, I was down in the hall and a prisoner called me aside and asked to speak to me. And he said to me, we've heard what has been said, and we can tell you that if he comes within 20 yards of you, we will, and to quote him, he will be decked. And I had to plead with him and say, please do not do that. Don't get yourself into trouble. I said, I'm quite happy that nothing will happen anyway. But that was the only occasion that I was ever, and I wasn't threatened to my face. I mean, it was just, someone sounding off, really. It wasn't any real threat. So, but I do understand, because I have had people in visiting the prison who couldn't get out quick enough. And they just didn't like the sense of being locked in behind locked doors. It made them feel very uncomfortable. So it's not for everyone, but people should not be afraid because generally speaking, they're reasonably safe places to be.
Yes, indeed. I want to pick up on something you mentioned there about chaplaincy volunteers. It's the way I got started. Say somebody says, okay, that sounds interesting. I'd like to maybe explore that a bit further. Any advice you'd give, and maybe as well bring in perhaps how the local church can be involved as well? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways. My first response to that would be through prison fellowship, and I'm sure that there is prison fellowship in England. It's certainly prison fellowship Scotland, based in Glasgow, that would be a good route in for people in through prison fellowship. What prison fellowship does is generally, well, certainly in Scotland, they have groups meeting in every prison in Scotland. So they would come in, for example, in Shotts prison, they were in on a Monday night for a couple of hours, and they would have a time of fellowship, Bible study, just a bit of chat and so on with prisoners. Some groups go in and lead a course called the Sycamore Tree Course, which is about restorative justice and based around the story of Zacchaeus. So, yeah, I think for anyone that's interested in volunteering in the prison, prison fellowship would be a good initial route to do that. As far as involvement out with and in churches, certainly in Scotland we have through care groups, one of them called Connect to Community, who are based in Glasgow, and Junction 42, who are in Edinburgh. And they work with people coming out of prison, and they're always looking for mentors to get alongside guys who are coming out of prison and trying to get re-established in community and perhaps established in a local church, particularly if they have come to faith inside the prison. It's daunting for a prisoner, albeit that they may have gone to church in prison, to come out and step into a church building, not knowing really what to expect or, how to dress or, I think because many of them have an image of churches where they're really kind of stuffy places and everyone's in shirts and ties and suits and now that for many churches is just not the reality. So to have someone who offers to go pick them up, to take them to church is a huge help. And as I say, there are organisations. I know certainly Alpha in London had a group called Caring for Ex-Offenders. So in England that would be an opportunity to get involved in that. They're mainly caring for, people who come out of prison. The other thing that can be done, often I think through prison fellowship, I know certainly in Scotland through prison fellowship, you could become a letter writer. And so you could be writing to perhaps prisoners who don't get any visits from family or anything. Quite often I think people who've been involved in the criminal justice system are written off often by their families. So they don't have any outside contact at all, and particularly for people doing long sentences, then it's good just to at least have someone that you could write a letter to. So that's another opportunity of getting involved.
Great. Yeah, look, let's say, a prisoner chaplain's been working with has, repented, had faith, believed in Jesus, become a Christian, and seems to be really growing in their faith in prison. But, time passes and they leave prison, obviously. And so they want to get involved in a local church, and that, obviously that's really important. What advice would you have for the local church in terms of helping that ex-offender, that ex-prisoner, I suppose, get settled into that church, get established, get rooted, that sort of thing?
I think that churches, they need to be welcoming. They need to be non-judgmental. They need to accept that even someone who perhaps coming out of prison, although they become a Christian, maybe their language, for example, is not what you would consider the norm for in church. They may come out and they're covered from head to foot in tattoos or whatever, so they may not fit what you think, is someone who would normally go along to church. And I think they've got to be very open and just accept that these are people who God loves, for whom Christ died, and they've accepted the same Jesus that we have. And so, therefore, they should be welcomed into the fellowship. Now, having said that, clearly, depending on what their offence has been. So, for example, you could have someone coming along to your church who's on the sex offenders register, for example. And I think that common sense has to be used. So you would not necessarily be thinking to put them into the Sunday school, for example, or so on. So I think good mentoring, good direction for people, and allowing them to use their gifts, but at the same time recognising that you don't want to put people in a situation that they shouldn't possibly be in. And I think that people do need a lot of help, they need a lot of support. Quite often you will find that, particularly people who've had past in addiction, sometimes even when they've committed their life to the Lord, they can kind of fall off the wagon again at times. And we need to be there for them and say, well, that's okay. Let's get you up and dust you down and help them to get back on track. It can be a difficult time for both the ex-offender and for the church or the mentoring to keep saying, yeah, you're fine. Let's help you. Let's support you. I mean, I think one of the big things too, the challenges of men getting out of prison is actually finding suitable accommodation in an area that is not taking them back to where they were before and back among old friends who might want to pull them back into ways of the past, and also for them finding employment. And that is a big thing. I was speaking to an ex-prisoner recently who applied for 3 jobs, and he was given the 3 jobs. He was never asked if he had any criminal convictions. There was nothing on the application to ask. But when they discovered that he had, he was fired from all 3 positions. It's so hard, and I said to him, did you tell them? He said, no. He said, they didn't ask. And so I didn't see a need to offer that information when they hadn't asked, and it wasn't in the application. He said, and if they had asked, I would have told them the truth. But he's found himself out of a job on 3 occasions. And so it's very, very difficult for people to get re-established. And I think the church can play a big part in that.
No, thanks for sharing. That's all really helpful. And just to mention as well, I know in England there are, depending on what an ex-offender or an ex-prisoner has done, there are various safeguarding procedures to go through, that sort of thing. Great. We're coming towards the end. We do this with all our guests. I just wondered whether you have a favourite Bible verse or favourite Bible truth. Yeah, anything to share on that?
When I retired over 2 years ago now, my last day in the prison was a Sunday. My last thing that I did was conduct a service. And I spoke on that occasion about Jesus healing the paralytic man. The man who had been brought by his 4 friends and lowered down to Jesus' feet. And on that occasion, I was speaking to the congregation and saying that this man came in through the roof. He had an encounter with Jesus and he left by the front door, a changed man. And I think for me, that is what sustained me in many ways through my time of working in the prison and in prison ministry generally, that we may come to Jesus in different ways. We may be lowered through a roof. We may come in one way, but when we really come face to face with Jesus and recognise who he is and recognise what he has done for us and recognise that everyone who calls in the name of Jesus will be saved, we can get up and walk out in a different way and as a different person. You can find change, you can find transformation, you can find forgiveness at the feet of Jesus and walk out a different person.
Dorothy, thank you so much for coming in. It's been really fascinating to talk to you. Dorothy, thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
To find out more about the work of Daylight Christian Prison Trust, go to daylightcpt.org. To make contact with us, send an email to office@daylightcpt.org. This podcast is produced by Good News Broadcasting. To find out more, go to gnba.net.